Welcome to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm Greg Bryan.
And I'm Jim Reski.
We're gospel addicts because we believe the gospel of Jesus isn't just good news, it's the best news ever.
We're addicted to the gospel because it doesn't just start us out in the Christian life, it is the Christian life.
Join us as we look at the Bible through the lens of the gospel.
Thanks so much for listening.
Ever wonder what it really takes to get into heaven? You know, like that whole pearly gates thing.
It's a question that's fascinated people for centuries.
Right. And today we're diving into this sermon by Alistair Begg, who's this, pretty prominent pastor.
He is. And he had some, let's just say some pretty surprising things to say about what it takes to get past those pearly gates.
Yeah. Surprising is one way to put it.
And that's what makes this such a fascinating deep dive. You see, Begg doesn't waste any time with, the usual platitudes.
He gets right to it.
Exactly. He tackles this whole question of salvation head on.
Right.
Well, his answer, it kind of challenges a lot of the assumptions people usually make about, faith and how it all works.
Okay, so no harp lessons required.
Not quite.
All right. So spill the beans. What does Begg say?
Well, he argues that a lot of us, we kind of approach faith like it's some kind of transaction.
A transaction?
Like we think, okay, if I do this or if I believe that, then boom, I'm in.
Oh, I totally get that. Like checking things off a list.
Exactly. But Begg, he says that's not how it works at all.
So it's not about being good enough, earning our way in.
Not even close. And to illustrate this, he uses this really powerful story from the Bible. The story of the thief on the cross next to Jesus.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That story always gets to me. Just the whole, the drama of it all.
It's incredibly dramatic, but it also just perfectly encapsulates Begg's point.
How so?
Well, here you have this man, right, literally at the end of his life, who's clearly lived anything but the saintly existence.
To put it mildly.
And yet, in that moment, he turns to Jesus, and what does he do? He asks to be remembered. Simple as that.
And Jesus grants his request. It's amazing, how that one interaction, right there in the midst of all that suffering, speaks volumes about grace and forgiveness.
It really does.
Okay, but how does that tie back to what we were saying about earning salvation?
Because the thief, he didn't do anything to deserve salvation. I mean, he didn't repent of his sins, didn't recite some creed, nothing. He simply acknowledged Jesus.
So it's not about checking all the boxes, performing all these rituals, doing all the right things. It's not even about, how much good we do in the world.
Not according to Begg. He actually says that this whole idea, this whole mindset of relying on our own efforts to earn salvation, it's actually dangerous.
Dangerous. Okay, now I got to know more. How is it dangerous?
Because Begg says it leads us down one of two paths, both of which are, you guessed it, pretty dangerous.
Two dangerous paths. All right, now you have to tell me more about these paths. Two dangerous paths, huh? Okay, now you got to spill the beans. What are these paths that Begg says we end up on?
Right, so Begg says, when we try to earn our way to, salvation through our own actions, we basically set ourselves up to fall into one of two traps.
Two traps?
Yeah. The first one, he calls it crippling despair.
Crippling despair. That sounds intense.
It is. It's basically this idea that, we set these impossible standards for ourselves, right?
Right.
And then because we're human, we inevitably fall short.
Which makes us feel
like we're just not good enough.
Ooh, yeah. I've been there. That feeling of never quite measuring up no matter how hard you try,
Exactly. It's like this constant pressure.
Yeah.
And it can be really paralyzing.
It can. So that's the first trap, crippling despair. What's the second one?
The second trap Begg talks about is what he calls self-righteous arrogance.
Self-righteous arrogance. Oh, boy.
Yeah, and this one is kind of the flip side of the first trap.
How so?
Well, it's what happens when instead of feeling like we're not good enough, we start to believe that we actually have earned our salvation through our own, goodness.
So it's like we become so focused on being good and doing all the right things that we kind of miss the point entirely.
Exactly.
And maybe even start, looking down on other people who we don't think are measuring up to our own, self-imposed standards.
Exactly. And Begg's point is that kind of judgment and self-righteousness, it's like the opposite of what true faith should be about.
So if those are the two traps, what's the way out?
Well, Begg says the alternative to both of these paths, the antidote to this endless striving, is grace.
Grace. Okay, so for anyone listening who might not be, super familiar with that term in this context, can you kind of break down what that means?
Sure. So grace in this context is really about accepting that, our worthiness, it's not something we earn.
It's on.
It's something that's freely given to us.
Oh, interesting.
It's about recognizing that our value, our acceptance, they come from something outside of ourselves.
So it's less about what we do and more about what we receive.
Exactly.
That's kind of a radical shift in perspective.
It is. It requires letting go of this need to constantly prove ourselves.
And
instead, just embracing this idea that we are already loved and accepted just as we are.
I can see how that would be incredibly freeing, like taking a huge weight off your shoulders.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, Big is talking about our relationship with God here. But I'm wondering, how does this idea of grace, of inherent worthiness, how does that play out in our everyday lives? Like how we treat each other, for example?
Yeah, that's such a good point. It's he's really shining a light on this very human thing we do, this need to earn our worth.
Absolutely.
And not just with, God or whatever, but with everyone, with each other.
It's true.
Yeah.
Think about it. How often are we sizing people up based on their, accomplishments?
All the time.
Their beliefs.
Their Instagram.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's we're constantly evaluating each other, holding ourselves up to this invisible yardstick. And it's exhausting. Always striving, always comparing, never feeling like it's, enough.
And I think that's part of why we struggle to extend grace to other people.
Because we're too busy trying to prove our own worthiness.
Exactly. We're so caught up in our own stuff. But this is where I think Begg's message, even if you're not coming from a specifically religious perspective, it's still really powerful.
How so?
Because what if, instead of all that judging and striving, what if we tried extending that same grace to other people?
How would that even look?
What if we just tried to look beyond the surface and just see each other as, inherently worthy of love and acceptance, just as we are?
Wow. That's a really powerful thought.
A total shift, right?
It's huge. Going from this mindset of judgment to a mindset of empathy and compassion.
Exactly. And that's not to say that we ignore bad behavior or pretend that everything is, sunshine and roses.
Sure.
But it does change how we approach, those situations.
Okay, I see what you mean.
When we start from a place of grace, we're just more likely to respond with understanding and kindness.
Even when it's hard.
Especially when it's hard.
Man, this whole conversation, it's given me a lot to think about.
Me too.
It's so easy to get caught up in that cycle of, earning and proving.
Yeah.
But Big, she's really reminding us that, true worthiness, it comes from a totally different place.
It does. And that's something, honestly, I think we all need to hear sometimes. It can really transform, not just our relationship with ourselves, but our relationships with everyone around us.
It's true. Well, this has been, I don't know about you, but I found this to be a really fascinating deep dive.
Absolutely.
We started off talking about getting into heaven, and somehow we ended up exploring these really profound truths about human nature, and how we relate to each other.
It's funny how these conversations go, right?
It's they take on a life of their own.
It's the beauty of ideas. They spark our curiosity. They challenge our assumptions. They invite us to see the world in these new ways. It's great.
I love that. And, speaking of new ways of seeing things, for everyone listening out there, we're going to leave you with this. How might Begg's message, this whole idea about grace and worthiness, how might that change how you view yourself?
Ooh, good one.
And how you view those around you? Just something to, chew on as you go about your day.
I love it.
Who knows? It might just lead you on your own little deep dive into the heart of what it means to be human.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. Feel free to contact us via email at gospeladdictpodcast@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode, and remember, on your worst days, you're never beyond the reach of God's grace, and on your best days, you're never beyond the need of God's grace.
See you next time.